One of the challenges when you animate in a puppet-based program, even in CGI too, is making natural looking poses. So I'm going to show you my method for working in Animate CC from Adobe. If you're working in Toon Boom's Harmony or Flash, the older version of this program, the principles I'm going to show you apply. So you can't beat a gesture drawing. And if you try to move a puppet, the problem is you end up with puppety animation. And the ultimate challenge again is to work with a puppet that doesn't look like a puppet. So you get the advantages of the puppet, but it moves nicely. So how this is done, at least in my case, is I use reference. So if I want to work into a pose that breaks out of the puppet, I really have to give myself something to work with. So in this case, I made a reference layer beneath and using some of the drawing tools in here, very crudely sketched a quick thumbnail. Let's padlock that. And I'm going to go into my puppet and then show you how that worked. And in this case, all we're looking at is the start pose, which is a very simple, bland pose, and then down and into this. So hopefully you can see we're breaking the puppet in several places. And when I say break the puppet, I mean we're doing things that really would not be intuitive if you were simply going to work by pushing symbols around. So if I just switch some of these off, and let's look at the torso to begin with. So I'm sliding it down to here. So how I structure this, the best approach was each symbol has its own internal timeline. And in this case, I use the reference layer of the gesture to be a position guide for the internal symbol. Go back out. We can pick the head, same thing here. So the head is going to move from this position to there. And in here, I use the reference guide again. Let's switch them all off and on again, so you can see the outlines. Now, I would never have pushed these things into such a coherent design simply by sliding and skewing the symbols by themselves. I had to have the drawing. That really helped me to go beyond what a simple symbol skewing would achieve. And each one of these symbols has its own internal shape tween. If you're working in Toon Boom Harmony, the process can be very similar. It has some differences, but the basics are there. And I can go through any one of these and show you the same. That's a very simple one. That wasn't too difficult. The other arm, though, was a lot more interesting because that is doing this joint break. And again, because I had the reference, I went far further and was far bolder, pushing the symbols into places that they really don't want to go. So it's going beyond the comfort zone of the symbol to create this really nice flow. That's basically it. So again, workflow would be, you have your start pose, you have a desire to get it into another key pose, so you draw it on a clean layer. You can make as many layers as you like, and then you can draw your reference. You can use the whatever brush tool you've got to draw your character in whatever angle you want them to be in. You get the idea. And then that can be your reference layer for the puppet. So a hand-drawn reference layer that will help you guide the puppet will really help you to go beyond puppety poses and to take the puppet rig and to basically do something that's much more close to full animation. This movie is aimed at people who use puppet-based systems. Certainly people who use Animate CC from Adobe, or sometimes Toon Boom Harmony too, can have issues like this that can arise when you use nested symbols. So let's take a look at this very simple animation. It's a really crude geometry, but I just want to give you the idea of the kind of principles that can apply even with any character. What I'm going to show you now is a problem that can happen anytime you move a motion tweened rig. So what's happening here, and it looks okay, I mean, it doesn't look awful, but when I plot the arcs, in this case I'm using a yellow dot for the head, a green dot for the physical right arm, and a blue one for the physical left arm, I think you can see the problem. And if I switch the character off, actually we'll just look at this layer by itself, here we go. So we have angles. And that's because you move the character's head into one position, and then the down, and then the up, and you get these arcless paths. Now, if I play the animation again by itself, it's the kind of thing that a lot of people might not even notice, but it's one of those things that is definitely holding back the animation. So here it is, smooth. Now I've fixed the animation. Now, if we look at the plots, they're not perfect, and they could still be tweaked some, but they certainly are light years better than the first draft. So in the case of Animate CC, and here's the actual hand-drawn plot, let's go into the puppet. And the solution was to make a guide path for each layer. And you could also nest the layers inside, like the arms, you could nest inside the body. I didn't do that for this because I find nesting too deep can cause problems sometimes. But in this case, I just made an arc for the major anatomy parts. So in this case, the hands are nested inside the arm. So I only had to make one guide layer for that. And if I unhide them and go to outline mode, those are the guide paths. And as long as the body and head and arms are on the relative guide paths, we get this really beautiful arced system. And again, the reason why this doesn't happen naturally, again, it's an artifact of moving keyframes. So if I go into the original one, this is all we have. We have one key here, one there, one here, and one there. This is using the classic tweening feature of Animate CC. I know that some software also allows arcing to be built in. Many people don't use that. I don't. So another solution would be, it's a little more of a crude workaround, would be to add more keyframes. So we would go into this point here and maybe move it down a little bit like this. The problem with that is you're making more keyframes, and that means you're potentially making more work for yourself. And you're not really making curved paths now, you're just adding another kind of indented line in the motion path. So the ideal way to do it is either to do it through a manual guide path, or to work with a tween system that has this kind of feature built in. But watch out for it, because if you are one of the people like me who still uses the classic tweening feature, it is something that you have to watch out for, because without doing something like this, you can end up with those very angular motions. And as you can see, this looks so much better. This is a simple animation of a bouncing ball in Adobe Animate CC, the kind of thing you've seen many times. But sometimes you might want a cartoonier effect, something that looks like it was hand-drawn frame by frame. And this is called a boil. This is when you do multiple drawings for each line. Now, this is obviously digital, so I used a wiggle line fill for this. Let me just go into the boil layer here. And the line tool itself, you can make it solid or you can make it wiggly. So in this case, I made the line wiggly, made some alterations so they would jitter, and I'm not going to go into the mechanics of that here, but that essentially is a line boil. Now, you may be working with software that makes this easy or tricky. It's kind of tricky in Animate CC, but it really applies to hand-drawn animation, and that's what I want to show you now. So this is a storyboard panel from a previous course I created about storyboarding. And one beautiful thing about a boil is that you can use it to keep a drawing alive. If I were to hold on this drawing, it would look dead. So let's hide that. Now I'm going to show you a very simple boil. What I've done is I've drawn 2 frames, 1 and 2, and toggled back and forth. So this is the timeline feature in Photoshop. I've done a course on this in the library called Animating in Photoshop if you want to figure out how to do this. So let me just play through, and that's a 2-frame boil. Now the problem with a 2-frame boil, you can get away with it, but it might feel a little bit mechanical. So here's a 3-frame boil. It's going 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. As you can see, I have 3 drawings here. You can cycle through. And if you really want to get fancy, a 4-frame boil. And as you can see, it seems to breathe. So you can keep a single image apparently alive. He doesn't feel like he's a static drawing anymore. And I've also got the other character here at the beginning as well, because of course there's 2 of them. And I did this guy with a different line style, a very tight line style. So the one on the right has a very artistic brush, a little more crude, and the one on the left is boiling. If you look very carefully, you'll see it's also got, let me see how many drawings that was. He's 3 drawings. And that also is just about enough to keep him not jittering, but breathing. And you can make boils wild. You can make them as loose or as tight as you like. As you can see, the effect's really nice. So it's not necessarily the high watermark of animation, but it's a nice little trick to have. It's easy to forget, especially when you're working in software that wants to give you these very rigid vector lines, to see if you can find a way to make the line boil. And like I said, it's a little bit tricky in some of them. I think Toon Boom Harmony has a much nicer line system that would probably allow you to do it. It might involve a little manual tweaking, sometimes from drawing to drawing. I know some software has it built in to really make it something you just push a button and it happens. I won't get into the specifics of programs, but just remember the fact that boiling can be really natural and the kind of thing that we used to do without thinking when we used to draw these things frame by frame. It's important to know the difference between 1s, 2s, and 3s, and the effect this can have on your scenes depending on how you approach your scenes and if you animate it on 1s, 2s, or 3s. Now, if you work in digital software like Maya, Max, Harmony, Animate, chances are you'll work on 24 or 30 frames a second on 1s. That means you can put a keyframe wherever you like, on 7, on 10, 14, 16, 17, without any problem at all. Now, the thing is that this isn't how we used to time our scenes. When we used to draw by hand, we would do it on 2s because you didn't want to do every drawing. You would do 12 frames a second. You would do a drawing on odd numbers, 1, 3, 5, 7, and so on. And then the camera operator would shoot these for 2 frames. And in some cases for 3s. That's why we talk about 1s, 2s, and 3s. The top row would be 24 frames per second, the middle row 12, and the bottom row 8. You see a lot of that in Japanese animation, anime, and that kind of stuff. And this was initially done to save time and money. You could spend a lot of time to do one drawing, and the fewer drawings you did, the better. Now, one thing that I've noticed throughout my career is that when I began to work on digital stuff and routinely began to animate on 1s, either 24 or 30 FPS, that I found I was becoming a little bit lazy. And one advantage of forcing yourself to animate on odd numbers is that I think it imposes a kind of a discipline that sometimes you don't get if you work on 1s. So in this case, the top row here would be on 24 frames per second. You would have your frames on 1, 3, 5, 7, and your lower ones on the same thing. This will be the different spacing. So you'd have a slightly faster frame rate, 15 frames per second if you're on 30 on 2s. You're at 12 frames a second on 2s there, on 24 frames per second. And of course, there's nothing stopping you from adding drawings in on 1s. If you feel this movement is too fast, you can go in and add a frame. That was the beauty of animating on 2s when we were drawing by hand. You could switch to 1s for the fast stuff and back onto 2s to save time and money. So how does this affect you if you're working in a digital program and you don't have that limitation? And again, I feel that it makes life much harder to do things like thumbnails and to plan scenes if you're always on 1s. And by saying just forget about either the odds or the evens, just work on 2s. Notice here for the first bunch of these frames, this drawing will be incomprehensible were I to put the entire thing in on 1s. You can see the physics so much more clearly on 2s. And I think the same thing applies when you're thumbnailing. If you restrict your thumbnails and your initial pass to the scene and the way you think about it, try it, see if it works for you. I'm not saying it's the law. It's just a technique to use to try to impose kind of a care on the way you approach a scene when you plan it. And again, this was good enough for the old timers in the golden age, and I think it still works. And I know this goes counter to, say, Richard Williams, who was always animating on 1s, and he had his reasons, but I really side with the old Disney guys against Richard. I think animating on 2s has many advantages, and I feel my work has sharpened up since I've begun consciously trying to work on 2s. Notice on frame 17, I squash, and then on 18, I'm on an even, because that has to be an instantaneous transition on 1s, and then 19, but on 20, I'm on even numbers, and I'm on 2s again, 22, 24, 26, 28, 32. I go back onto 1s here very briefly, 34, 35. So I'm not imprisoned to stay on odd numbers all the time, but it definitely helped me to plan this out, to know when I was slipping to 1s, when I was going back to even numbers, and then go right back onto 2s. And let me show you some other examples and you'll see what I mean. That's the animation of that. So here's a thumbnail that I planned out. And again, by virtue of being on odd numbers, I can add in the extra drawings on wands, and they will be if this is going to be done with a puppet. In this case, I'm drawing this, so I don't want to have to draw these drawings if I don't think they're going to be needed, because it might take you half an hour to do one drawing. So I've just saved myself 6 hours also by going on to twos rather than ones. And this way, by planning it out, using the little reds actually also indicate where breakdown drawings will go, where extra little business will happen. So it's just easier to remove a lot of the clutter and frees up your mind just to look at the drawing, the timeline, in a way that's much sharper and much cleaner. That's the final scene. So I'm very happy with that. And again, I think this is largely the result, or at least partially the result, of thinking on twos and not getting lost in the maze of wands. So if you're working on, again, digital 30 FPS, try to think on twos, and you have 15 FPS, frames per second. If you're drawing by hand, if you can keep it on 24, 12 drawings a second, and that is smooth. Let's look at a simple effects undulation in Animate CC, but any software that can use any kind of morphing, or like Toon Boom Harmony, or even After Effects might be able to handle similar effects. So again, I'm just going to tunnel into the first of these three symbols. And this one I really enjoy because it's one keyframe. So the start is the same as the stop. It's just one drawing. And I've created this forced shape tween by adding shape hints. So I won't go too deeply into the nuts and bolts of Animate CC, but it's under Modify, Shape, Add Shape Hint, or Control-Shift and H. So I made A, B, C, and D hints for the corner, the first frame and the last one. And then I made two down here, E and F on the first. And on the second one, I just shoved them up to the top. And depending on where you place them, you might get some really weird things happening. And I always advise people to back up their project before they do this, because occasionally it can crash. If I slide these around, you'll see I'll start to get different effects. Different shapes will begin to emerge. We can change the ones down here. This will make maybe a less dramatic change. Notice how the bottom barely moves now. You might want that effect. There's a slight little corner, a kink happening here, and that may be because my original shape is a little off, so we can mess around with that and soften that out. I won't waste any more time on that one. What happens if we then add a second keyframe? So here we have the same start here at the beginning and the end, but this time I've added a completely different shape in the middle. I've also broken up the timeline just so I can see the different hints so that they're not crashing into one another, but it's basically the same image here and here. And again, the same process happens on the first of these frames. We have E and F. On the second one, E and F move to here. And on this frame, E and F start at this point and they move up to the top. And so now we have a really nice undulation. And I can just move that point to here. They slightly overlap a little bit. That's what the addition of one extra frame buys us. Let's see what happens if we go just one further. And in this one, I have it in outline mode. Let's switch it on. And here I've gone a little further with the shapes and I've pulled them into more interesting forms, certainly on this one here. And the same thing, A, B, and C, D lock down the corners. And E and F, they force the vertical movement. You could keep adding more hints. You could add a G and an H, an I and a K. But again, the more shapes you add, the less predictable it might become. But this one now on the right is really starting to look very, very believable as smoke. So that's a very nice way to do very effective steam smoke effects. We can apply the same principle to waves, to any other object that's going to have amorphous quality to it or a slightly chaotic motion. So what I'm going to do is switch off all of these and just go into one of these symbols. Let me unhide the area around so we can see the whole thing. Again, if I go into the symbol, this will look familiar. We have our start and our stop. They are identical. I just had to draw one image. And then modify, shape, add shape hint, and we can hide the new one. And all I had to do was three. A and B lock down the corners, and C here on the down point of the curve On the next image, it goes to there. Now, depending on how far I push that C hint, we get a more dramatic motion. And you can see how nice that is. We have these little extra wave points just emerging out of nowhere. And that's really nice because that's kind of how water acts. If I move this even to here, we'll get a much more violent movement. We could add more hints, and who knows what effects would happen. So that's nested inside a symbol. We have another symbol here, slightly different color, and another symbol here, slightly different color. And these tween then on an outer layer, and that creates this really nice rolling, roiling ocean effect. So it's certainly a nice way to get very quick and dirty on what would be otherwise very difficult to achieve hand-drawn animations by using shape tweening, or in Toon Boom Harmony, morph tweening would be the tool that you would use to achieve the same kind of effect. In a previous movie, I showed you how we could use shape tweening or morph tweening in a animation software to achieve very nice effects animations. Now I'm going to show you how we would do that if we were drawing by hand. And essentially the same principle in theory. In practice, when you're drawing by hand, it's a little trickier, but let me walk you through it. So here we have a curvy line. What I want to do is to have this line cycle or animate into itself. So let's walk through it like this. And that's it. That's how it does it. Now, incidentally, I'm working in Photoshop, which does have an animation timeline feature. It's very basic, but it's quite usable. I have a course in the library called Animating in Photoshop. So that's there if you want to pursue this further. In any event, here's how we do it. So we have our curved line. You take a bump on the line here, call this A. And on the one we want to animate into, we find that point up here and go, that is also A. And as you can see, this can be, I could have picked any point on this line. I thought I want this bump here to animate into that, or to at least in between into that. And likewise on the opposite side, B here will turn into this. So actually one will slightly overshoot. So this side here will go faster than this side. And when I in between, that's the result. So I'll just show you the first key, and then that's the breakdown, or the big gap between the two, and that's the third. So again, it's 1, 2, 3. Notice too the letter C is coming in. So as we go from 1 to the breakdown, I'm also going to plot this point here so I don't totally lose track of it. And that gives us an armature or a skeleton that we can then build the rest of the animation around. You also notice it doesn't take very long to draw. So I was able to figure out, I like that. That has a nice, sinuous, natural, smoky feel to it. I didn't have to waste more than 15 or 20 minutes to realize this was going to work. So here we are with the second side filled in, and I was again working a little loose, so it's not perfect. But again, it's starting to still look like smoke. It's not going down, it's not doing anything weird. So the next path after that was to tighten it up a little bit more. And once you get it into this kind of groove, then sometimes what I will do is I'll go through and go frame by frame by frame forward. And that will often help me to find trouble spots. For example, here, this is a trouble spot. See how this little curve here on the next frame seems to be going down? That's not what we want. We want every one of these curves to feel like they're moving up. So that was the kind of thing that I had to solve and tidy up a little bit. So I did tidy it up quite a lot. And this was a labor of love. Like, I put a lot more time into this than I would have thought. But it was about an afternoon well spent. And you can see at the top here, I'm doing things that you really would have a very hard time doing were you working inside Animate CC or Harmony, breaking up the symbol into those lovely little poofs. And that was something that I achieved just going through. Initially, I in between the whole thing, and then I realized it didn't have that kind of flow. So again, I would do a drawing, go through the next one, the next one, the next one, and did it straight ahead, basically. On the one hand, you do a keyframe, a breakdown, and it's the main body of it was kind of pose to pose. But when I began doing these little things breaking apart at the top, they were very much done straight ahead. It was so much easier to do them straight ahead and then roll through and make sure it was all working. So that's starting with the same skeleton that I had from the previous one in black and white. And let me show you this thing in full motion. So when we export it from Photoshop, then you can see it in the proper frame rate. And the thing to watch out for is everything's moving up. I don't think we have any spots that seem to be shooting down. There might be a couple around here that sometimes seem to bulge down this way, so that could be a little trouble spot right there. But the part that I'm very happy with is the way this hole opens up, this little donut, and then poof, disintegrates into all these little clouds at the top. And here it is rendered out in After Effects with a little blur on it, so it looks more like smoke. Not too bad. Effects animation like this isn't really my primary thing, so it's great fun when you get a chance to do it, and it actually turns out reasonably nice. Don't feel you're going to get anywhere near the effect you'll want too quickly, but it's the kind of thing that is worth taking time with and practicing on. And don't be afraid to work straight ahead too if you feel like you're just getting stuck. We've all had the boss or the client who says the magic words, "Can you make it pop?" And the problem with being told to make it pop is that basically it means nothing. So let's use concrete language to describe the things that we want to see. And concrete language will enable us to communicate like professionals. So in this case, we have changed tonal value, saturation, composition, and we can go even further than this. So let's first look at color or saturation, how we can take a color image and amplify it. And we can even add color ranges that are even deeper than this. And okay, this pops now. That's not really what's happening. I'm adding a blue saturation and then a very dramatically opposing color to that. I've increased the intensity of the colors. So I haven't changed the tonal values. These have the same tonal values on the drawing beneath. The color is what's catching the eye here more than anything. So let's take a look at another example of that. Here is a character in ancient Greece. And again, I added a little tonal wash. This did actually amplify the colors when we go from here to here. They're definitely more strongly saturated. So they're kind of chalky and desaturated in my original. And now the tonal value, the blacks to whites, deeper. The ranges are much deeper from the grayscale, but the colors are also richer as well. So let's take a look at the original image and see how we would apply some of these techniques to this. Now, when I draw an initial pass, I like drawing with a very scratchy brush because it keeps me from getting too tied down. And it's also a little more lifelike and forgiving. But if we do like a cleanup on the line, then we get something that's immediately giving us a much stronger tonal contrast between the characters and the background. This by itself separates them from the background and gives them more priority in the scene. We can increase the saturation of the background. This was a very simple thing to do. I had the entire thing on layers. Each color is on a separate layer, so I could just target each one, go into its blend mode in Photoshop and just take it from a pale blue to a deeper blue. We could go even brighter than this, but I didn't want to go too bright on the first pass. And then the characters themselves. Because I increased the saturation of the background, we want to increase the color saturation of the characters also in their palettes. So these are fairly hot, and I know a lot of shows go way hotter than this, but I wanted to keep it within, again, a certain constraint to begin with because we're going to go a lot further than this. So in the next movie, we'll start adding some lights. In the previous movie, we began the process of making an image pop, except we're going to use meaningful language to talk about the process. So we took the original drawings and we put a cleanup line over them, or you could use a vector line or whatever line tool you like. We increased the saturation of the colors, but now let's add some lights. So here is the procedure of adding lights, and it was quite simple. Working in Photoshop, 3 or 4 layers to put a vignette or a gradient at the edge of the screen, a shadow layer to show light casting shadows on the back wall of the spaceship here and here. And this also increases the visual depth of the background, and it pushes these consoles out in 3D space toward us. And then we can add the same to the characters. Now this might or might not be possible depending on what software and style you use. There's different ways of achieving it. You can use some of it with flat fill. Also, if you're working in CGI, then the software itself will cast shadows. But in any event, there's a nice touch to go from that to that. But even this by itself looks good. I even added a bit of extra detail to the background, and that also gave a little more texture so that we don't just have these empty dead walls here, which look a little bit dull. So when you're working with tonality, which is basically what we're doing here, it's good to keep the tonal ranges under control. The reason why you're seeing 11, 22, 33, when I do add or work in black and white, when I'm thinking about a scene in these kind of values, it's kind of nice to work in base 11 because it's really quick to type in the numbers. And you can just find 1, 1, 2, 2, 3, 3. And you're not losing much. You're actually simplifying the tonal range a little bit. To show you what you can achieve with just 3 to 4 tonal values. And I've used this graphic before in my storyboard course if it looks familiar. So here we have a cubical form, and that is just 3 extra tones. And we have a very dramatic light. It's like there's a window behind us, and this is like a natural daylight. And with one simple change too, we have the same shot. Now it's nighttime and we have fluorescent lights. So it's astonishing what can be done. And I would suggest, if you're curious, to try doing this yourself. Take a line drawing and be very strict. Give yourself no more than 4 tonal values and see what you can do with it. And maybe do like 2 or 3 different lighting effects. Here's another one, a napkin sketch of robots from flying saucers. And with 3 tonal values, 1 for the sky, 1 for the saucer, and a darker one for the robots, suddenly you feel the power of the beams to go from this to that. And to show the power of changes, this beautiful medieval town is a very dramatically lit night scene. And that was done with 1 or 2 layers in Photoshop. It was really not very many. It was quite simple to get that effect. And that gives you almost a free second background. So again, that is really going from a very flat tonal space to a very deep one. And there are many other variants that you could do. I mean, we're not limited to this and this. That's just to give you the feeling for one small change. So just to show you how quick it was in Photoshop to add all that lighting magic, there's the vignette layer, and it's on a normal 100% opacity. The next one was the primary shadow layer, and normal on 55%. Just rough them in. It was quite quick, and as long as they follow the kind of contours of the background, they look quite believable. The light beams was just like another kind of soft layer here. Blend mode multiply 43%. And I put some little bright spots here, but you could live without them even. A couple of beams. These were drawn with the round brush. So in the brush tool, if you use the soft round brush, then you can draw with something like that. And it gives you a very nice, very believable air. And then the last one was the light. And again, with the round brush, with the brush set to an opacity of about maybe 50 or 60%, then you can start drawing in these like light beams. That was it. Took about 10 minutes. So to go from this to that, and you could do different versions. You could light the scene different ways with the same background art. You could have a light coming from the monitor. You could have the light coming from over the shoulder, cast shadows in different directions, and have different variants of the same background. So that's the power of tonality and light. Hopefully that made it pop. In the previous 2 movies, we used color, saturation, and light or tonality to emphasize or accentuate a piece of our design background. The awful word, make it pop. So let's look at another approach that we can do to improve this image. And that would be to change the camera angle. This will also affect the composition of the shot. So I'm going from our start to this. So what I'm going to do is basically a change that doesn't break the bank. So I'm taking the original artwork and slightly altering it. So this alteration, you might think that took a lot of time. I had the entire drawing on layers in Photoshop, and I was able to skew most of them. Usually skewing a layer will give you 20 degrees, that kind of range of motion up or down before you break the artwork and before you can't really go any further. So again, we went from this to that, and it's kind of a more dramatic shot. It feels more like a wide angle lens where it pushes in on the characters a little bit more. Definitely I prefer the second image to the first. So this is the kind of thing I'd like to see rather than that. Anyway, let me walk you through some camera angle business. So perspective, in this case, I'm showing you different perspectives, can create very, very different camera angle results. So here we have our character standing at the bus stop. And what this is a horizon is very low. This pushes the viewer, you, down lower toward the gutter, sorry. So we're more looking up at the characters as they're gazing off into the distance. So this is a very nice dynamic composition as well. It allows us to squeeze in a lot of information. We can see the characters in the bottom left, the ambulance is driving off into the distance. In this case too, we have a nice chase scene when the giant robot is chasing the little man forward. And again, it's a low camera angle. The horizon line is about 1/3 down the screen. Here we have a Union Jack composition, the little X right in the middle. Right here is Kubrick is a master of these kind of shots. I would use them sparingly, but this one works really nicely. And there you can see the compositional tool. So there's all kinds of different ways of doing it. And actually this shot, I didn't really do it consciously as a Union Jack, but that's certainly, the eye line is pretty much in the middle, not too far off from there. So the solution was to go lower. And that's what I did from here to here. And it gives less floor, more ceiling, and then just position the characters accordingly from that to that. In the next movie, we will do something a lot more dramatic than this. Over the course of the last few movies, we've taken a decent image and we've improved it. We've improved the color, the lighting, and the composition. But to go any further, we really have to break it. And that means do something totally new. And this is what you're kind of putting off and trying to avoid because it's the most amount of work. So before I do that, let me show you some tricks of composition. So a great way to see strong compositional techniques is to look at the illustrations from the 19th century by the studio of Gustave Doré. And you can see immediately like strong diagonals. And these cut the composition up into these very strong triangular shapes. And they're just more interesting to look at. And you can see them after a while. They sort of jump out at you once you know what to look for. Here's another one. These are from The Rime of the Ancient Mariner. More secondary diagonals on that side. Don Quixote, love this illustration. And again, by now you should be able to see the diagonals, the big one here, the characters, and that gives us what I've marked out in green and blue. Love this one as well. Spectacular, isn't it? And the same thing here, we have very strong from one corner to the other. It might not be immediately obvious here, but again, we have obvious diagonal line of interest from the character to the castle here too. And by now again, it should be jumping out. Even here, where we're looking flat on to the background, the figures are creating this wonderful diagonal motion up and down. Yet another diagonal. Even with these strong verticals of the tower, the main energy, force, action is on this diagonal or triangular path. So with that in mind, what you're seeing here is verticals. And even though they're slightly tilting in, there's not much of a triangular element here. And I thought, well, if we're going to go, any further than this, we need something that looks more like that, or maybe we have the characters tilting in at an angle. That's roughly what I had in mind. So I'll show you what I came up with. So we've moved the camera down. It's a heroic upshot. I've given the tall character like a hero pose. And what we have now, let me just move this dud layer here. Look familiar? So we can probably come up with better poses than that, but that is certainly a decent start in terms of plussing, improving the composition, the poses, the characters. This is the kind of thing when the client says, can you make it pop? This is the kind of thing they have in mind. They just don't have the language to describe it. And that's why it can be infuriating when you're dealing with clients who don't have the language when really all they really want is something like that, but the complete inability to describe it. But as you've seen over the course of the last few movies, it's actually quite simple. And can you improve the composition? Can you make the lighting more dramatic? Can you make the colors more intense? That's basically it. And it's just knowing where you want the camera to go, what kind of poses you want the figures to be in. And I haven't, mind you, tied down the drawing on the right, but you get the idea. I mean, I could have spent another 7 or 8 hours going in and beautifying that. But at that point, I would give the client 3 or 4 variants, very quickly roughed in before I would go to all the trouble of drawing what you see on the left side again on the right side. That's it. That is concrete language being used to describe the process of how to make an image pop. Some do's and don'ts, and these are kind of high-level do's and don'ts. They're not like do squash and stretch, and there's nothing like that. These are more high-level overview kind of things to watch out for. This one sounds kind of contradictory. Don't be too technical, but do plan. So let me explain. At one point in my career, I got so wound up by worry that I had a block, and I was so self-conscious about my drawing that I would freeze up. A co-worker gave me this book by Seamus Culhane, and he talked about his discovery. He had the same problem. He worked on Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, the Disney movie, and somebody gave him this Nicolaides book, The Natural Way to Draw. And it's like, loosen up, draw fast, don't be bogged down by the nuts and bolts. You can tie things down later. And that saved him. That got him to flow, and suddenly he was doing all the footage he had to do. So I thought, I've nothing to lose, so I'll try it. And I tried it, and it worked. So having said that, you don't want to go maybe too far down the extreme of never planning. So in the method that he described, you would keep working in the gesture drawing mode for as much as you can. When you're planning your scene out, when you're in thumbnail mode, or when you're working your key poses, you don't go in with the cleanup. You don't go in with tie downs. You're trying to keep your drawings loose, gesture drawings, and do them fast. And don't allow the mechanics to overwhelm you. So you're in a more fluid state of creation, let's say. So these are some examples of the kind of things. So, you're not taking more than 30 seconds to a minute to do a drawing. That said, you still need to plan. So what I try to do is to combine the best of both. So I do these elaborate thumbnails. If you've seen any of my courses, I always thumbnail everything. I think a lot of the books kind of underplay the importance of thumbnails, so I try to make up for that by going the other way. And in this case, I try to keep my thumbnails loose, gesture drawings, but planned. So you have that tension between the freedom of the gesture drawings and then the tight control planning of the thumbnail process. So another issue that's more technical really is about arcs. And when you work in Puppet systems, and this is going to apply mostly to you, people who are using Harmony or Animate CC, and it depends how you rig your puppets as well. Sometimes when you move a puppet rig, it'll look okay, but maybe something doesn't quite feel right. And usually what that thing that's catching your eye or making you a bit off about it is the arcs. Let me show you how easy it is for these things to go wrong. So, and I've covered this in a previous movie, I'll just show very quickly again. Here we have a simple puppet animation of the kind many people do. If you actually plot these arcs, they're all angular. They're not arcs at all. There's some appear here, but for the most part, they're just straight lines. And a lot of people don't notice because the thing moves so quick. But the solution is, one solution is plot your arc. So you put a clean drawing over it and you put dots down, or in this case, I've used these little symbols inside the hand to create these graphics that show me the different arc patterns, improve them. So in this case, I just made little guides for the body and the head to put everything on a proper arc path. So again, this is an emergent property that comes out of some puppet rigs. So solution, first identify the problem and make sure that you have the problem, or you might not, and pick a point of the character like the wrist and just plot that point throughout the entire range of animation and see what the arc path looks like. And applies to hand drawing. If you have a hand drawing, in this case I have a hand-drawn walk cycle, and this was done in Harmony, but I put a clean layer over it, put a dot, and then another dot, and I'm plotting the wrist here of the right arm, and the frame number, and then I can see where the in-betweens are going to go, and I know the spacing and timing of the in-betweens, I can have the keys and in-betweens, and that is going to move beautifully. And you can pick the elbow, you can pick the wrist, and you can see all of these different parts. When you plot them and go, that's going to be a quality. No one's going to look at that and say the arcs feel weird. Another issue that the puppet people, by which I mean people who use Harmony or Animate CC, will face is the problem of pushing puppets. I am as guilty of this as anybody. You take your Flash puppet, your Animate puppet, your Harmony puppet, and you just start moving it around. And before you know it, you have an animation done. The only problem with that is you're doing puppet animation. You're not really doing animation with a puppet, if that makes sense. So if you want to make a puppet do animation of the best quality that puppet can do, you really want to draw. And again, you don't have to draw particularly well, but the worst drawing will usually get you somewhere better than just puppet pushing. So in this case, I wanted to go from this standing pose into this crunch pose. So by creating this reference layer, I was able to use that to guide my puppet into something that would look so much better. So again, that's the importance of don't just blindly push the puppet. Do a quick sketch, at least for really good, strong poses. Maybe you can't do it for every key pose in your scene, but you might find there's a couple of strong ones that would really help to emphasize the puppet animation. Huge problem today is camera moves that move too much. And this happens in live action CGI shows now. It drives me nuts. So staging shots correctly is almost a lost art in some cases. So it's where should the camera go? What's the best camera angle to tell the character dynamics of a shot? Let me give you some examples. So the old hand-drawn animation era, we obviously had pan scenes. Those were common enough. No harm there. We also had tracking shots where we would move into the characters, zoom in on them. And the kind of shot that I think is a little overdone now, where these kind of orbit shots where we're moving around the character. They're not bad. I just think sometimes we move the camera to character relationship a little too much. This is a cheat one that I did to show how you might cheat an orbit in 2D. So I'm not saying don't do them. I'm saying use them only where they're going to really add something of value and not because they look cool. This is a good example of a correct camera placement because it shows the domineering boss, the browbeaten employee, and moving the camera in this shot achieves nothing. It would actually distract from that. So there are other shots where the camera should move. This wouldn't be one of them. So try to avoid thinking on the screen or on the timeline and try to plan and timing. And when I say plan timing, I mean on twos. So by thinking on the screen, I mean when you work in CGI or Toon Boom or Animate CC, where you're trying to time the scene out by moving the keyframe back and forth. Sometimes we do that, but if that's what you're doing all the time, then you're not really learning timing. You're just kind of guessing. And the beauty of planning your timing consciously by sitting down and thumbnailing a scene and working it out in advance, okay, it's an estimate, but it's an educated estimate. And every time you do that, and then you apply it and see how accurate it is or isn't, you're learning something. Whereas I don't think you learn quite so much about timing when you're just moving keyframes on the timeline. So when I say don't shoot for the moon and do have a realistic challenge, the kind of thing I'm warning about is the kind of person who, and I've met them, who have very unrealistic ambitions and they're doomed to fail. And it's really sad because they end up just sabotaging themselves. So please don't be this person. If you have an ambition to lift very heavy weights, you start out with something that's a bit lighter, that's still hard enough work. You graduate up to a challenge that you can then meet. The goal I find is to have a task that's just slightly out of reach. You have to stretch for it and really work for it, but it's not impossible. It's an achievable goal. So you have these series of plateaus that you want to reach. So each one of these verticals you can scale at some point. They're not impossible, but you could never, for example, teleport from here to there. So you want to, again, set the challenges, set these goals that are definite plateaus above where you've been before. And this could be on the level of your work quality or even your work quantity. Final warning about burnout and about applying your stuff properly. So one problem with burnout is, especially in animation, you could, and it's happened to me twice, where you end up working ridiculous hours, like 80 hours a week or more. And if you do it for long enough, at some point a part of your brain will go, I can't do this anymore. And your brain will simply stop giving you the energy that you need to do that work. So it's very easy to be in this trap when you're in your 20s. That's when it happened to me twice. It's never going to happen to me again. I simply won't let it. I can't. So you want to preferably avoid ever having it happen to you at all. That would be the ideal. So try to feel when you're in that danger zone. Figure out some way to not be in that danger zone. That's all I can say, because you will end up worse off. Doesn't matter how much you want to work, your brain will simply not let you. And it's a horrible feeling because part of you wants to work and the other part of you goes, I can't do it anymore. So that is probably the most important takeaway, I would think, from this movie. And one last detail. And here I'm going to disagree with Richard Williams, who warns people against using headphones. There are times when you should use a headphone and times when you shouldn't. You shouldn't use a headphone if the stuff that you're working on is a very complex. If you're thumbnailing a complex action or a scene and it requires your complete attention, if there's some aspect of the work that is just too detailed, no, you shouldn't listen to music. You shouldn't listen to a podcast. But many aspects of our job are just ruthlessly repetitive and just numbing. I strongly recommend when you do those that you do listen to either your favorite podcast or music or radio or whatever, and then go back to take them off and stop if you have to concentrate again. That way you will go a long way towards protecting your mind from that burnout scenario that I described, because it'll give your mind something else to deal with. Audiobooks are also a fantastic thing to do, because then you can listen to any number of books that way too. And you're getting something into your mind that's distracting you from the fact that you have to do maybe 120 in between drawings that are just not interesting. They're purely mechanical. They don't require you to be concentrating on them. You can get to a point with those where you can do them on autopilot. So the last thing you want to do is just to be doing that and nothing else. That, I think that would be very damaging. So in that respect, I would respectfully disagree with the advice Richard Williams gave from the Animator Survival Kit. I'm a huge admirer of Eric Goldberg and his book, Character Animation Crash Course. I strongly recommend it. And in chapter 8 of his book on timing, he mentioned something that caught my eye, which was that the shortest amount of screen time for a hold or a moving hold to register is 6 frames, and anything else tends to look like a camera error or the interruption of an action. That's what he says. So I wanted to test that out and see where the cutoff might be, if you can get away with 5 or 7 better. So in Photoshop, I animated this very, very simple gesture. It's kind of a putting on the Ritz kind of move. Now, I'm a big fan also of animating in Photoshop, and I have a course in the library on how to do that. So if you love to draw and you feel a little put off by a lot of animation software, I really recommend that course and this program. Now, that said, it doesn't quite play at the right frame rate. It tends to play a little slower. So this is really playing maybe 3 or 4 times slower than it should. So let's take a look at what this looks like when we render it out. So as you can see, we don't see that nice little gesture at the opposite side here. It's simply, it feels like a punch. It's almost invisible. So let's give it a 3 frame hold. It's still too fast. So we'll give it a 4 frame hold. It's definitely a little better, but it's still not really reading like its own pose. We'll go to 5. And now we're starting to feel it a little better, but it's still too fast. So the shortest number of frames that Eric mentioned was 6. And we're just about barely getting away with it now, where, yep, we can see him right there. And of course, if we go to 7 or 8, then it really feels like he's putting on the Ritz. So one thing to bear in mind is that this pose isn't just this held frame. It could also be in-betweens that we're easing into it. So this frame here is also helping this pose to read. And had I done a few more in-betweens, 2 or 3 or 4 more here, we get something more like a moving hold, which is what he mentioned also in that book. So by adding like a few more in-betweens, it means fewer frames we would have to hold the actual drawing itself. So as you ease in and ease out of that pose, you want to accentuate or read, then you have to remember too, the in-betweens also, if they're close enough to it, they can be a part of that 6 frames. And one thing to remember, and this is really crucial, when you read the animation textbooks by Richard Williams or Eric, or most of the ones that are in print, I think all of them, when they talk about frames, most of them seem to be referring to 24 frames per second. And as you can see, if you are working on 30, then it's different. So when Eric, for example, says 6 frames, he's talking about a 24 per second frame, 1/24th of a second, not 1/30th of a second. So you need to pad that. If you're working on 30, that means it's going to be 7, maybe preferably 8, if you want a moving hold or a hold gesture to really have an impact. And these numbers add up. So if there's something else, like if you read one of the books and they say you need 12 frames for a specific action, translation, 15 if you're working in 30. So if you find your scenes are moving a little too fast, that might be why. In a previous movie, we talked about how many frames you need for a physical pose, like the full body pose, to register on the eye. In this movie, we're going to look at expressions. And again, I'm going to go back to Eric Goldberg because this is material taken from his book, The Character Animation Crash Course, which I strongly recommend if you haven't bought it already. So in chapter 8 of that book on timing, he says that you need 12 frames is about enough for a facial expression to register. So I thought I would do a little test scene, very crude, very simple. We have our figure just here, and we give him like a little growl. So what I want to figure out is how many frames does it require for the audience to see he's losing his patience. Now, again, this is animated in Photoshop. I have a course in the library on how to animate in Photoshop. If you like the look of this, I recommend it very strongly. That said, let's proceed and look at what this scene feels like when we render out this video and play it at the right frame rate. So here it is when we hold the angry face for 2 frames. And as you can see, it feels like a twitch. I'm actually kind of hard pressed to see what's going on here. So we'll hold that for 3. No good. 4. Slightly better. So I'll just run through these. 5, 6. 6, and we're starting to feel like it is like a sudden loss of patience, but it still feels much too fast. 7, 8, 9, 10. So now we're in the range of times where we will just about be able to read this. And now even at 11, I'm starting to see, okay, he's angry there. And 12 being the minimum that Eric recommended. And that feels about right. I say this in many of my movies. Always remember, 24 frame per second frames are different from 30. When all the animation textbooks talk about frames, they mean 24 FPS, not 30. So that 11 or 12 will translate into 14 or 15 if you're working on 30 FPS. In the previous example I showed you, it was looking directly out at the viewer with no motion, which is a very artificial way of illustrating this, because when you animate and you're doing these facial expression changes, chances are pretty good that your figure will not be bolted down, but they might be moving, they might be tilting, the head could be rotating, the body could be moving. So if we begin to apply one of these expression changes here, it does alter things very slightly, but let's see how. So here I've rendered out the turn again, did a bunch of them, but this is the one where I hold on the angry face for 10 frames. And what's happening here is that the in-between drawings on each side here and on the way out, back again, they also help to let that expression read. So although the final pose is held for 10, those two also give us +1, +1, and more in-betweens would also help to make the angry face read longer. So again, don't forget your in-betweens and how close they are to the pose that you want to register with the audience. It's very important. That's it. So always remember to give your expressions enough frames to breathe. There's a subtlety of computer tweening that might not be obvious to people. If you compare the way we do tweens now in digital software compared to how we used to do them by hand when we hand drew all our animation, let me show you the difference and why this might be important to you. So here is a little pendulum swing that I created in Adobe Animate CC. I would have had a very similar result if I did this in After Effects or Toon Boom Harmony or any digital software. So let me show you the keys I made here. This is the swing left, swing right, and then back again to complete the cycle. Now, the position of all these in-betweens looks really nice. If I put onion skin on, you can see what I mean. It's perfect. I mean, it's absolutely perfect spacing. And this was done by the computer. So I click on anywhere between here. And most digital tweening programs, and whether they're CG or whether they're hand puppet system flat, they'll have some kind of system like this, Bezier handles that control the ease ins and the ease outs between the different keys. So in this case, we have this result. Now, we didn't have Bezier handles when we animated by hand. And let me show you, let me switch off the onions and play this through. This is a hand drawn on 12 frames a second. So were I to position these on paper, as you would have seen in the Golden Age and Warner Brothers cartoons or Disney cartoons, it would have been more like this. And this would have been determined by a timing chart. In this case, the first key is number 1. That's here. And number 17 is here. The spacing of all the in-betweens is then set by the timing chart. So the next thing to do would be to go into number 9, and that would be here, hanging straight down. And then we're easing out of frame 1 and easing into frame 17. Let me put onions back on again. And I'll put the timing chart on too, because this is really good. Because now you can see very clearly. So 9 is here. This one here will be 7. And we're going in increments of halves again. So this is 5, 3, 1. And the opposite here, this is 11, 13, 15, and into 17. All determined by this timing chart. Now, I felt when I made this, now don't forget too, by the way, we do in-betweens then between each one of these to smooth it out a bit more. And so we can go onto something that looks a lot nicer. But it still has a different feel from the digital one, because again, the digital one has this completely naturalistic spacing that we really don't get when we do this by hand. And really never did. It was very unusual for an animator to go to all the trouble of spacing out timing with that much realism, because these had to be drawn by hand, and it's easier to do in-betweens if they're 50% or 1/3 between the two keys. So I decided though that that one was a little bit too clunky. So I did a new one up here, and this is a different timing chart. So in this case, let me compare it with the other chart below. So here was the original one here, and it's all spaced out on halves, and that gives us that spacing. So I thought, let's try a different one. So there's no in between here, but there's a 1/3 favor. So, and then we have a much sharper ease in and ease out. So what that looks like is much nicer, I think. Getting a little closer to what we were seeing with the more perfect digital one, but still noticeably different, noticeably hand-drawn. And if I go back here and switch on the onions again, you can see we're having a much sharper gathering at the top point. So there's much more texture on that too. It really feels like there's energy in the swing. And once again, we're able to go in and put on wands. So if I show you here, the spacing is different from here. This is perfect. This is not, but this works fine. So this is something to be really conscious of if you are working on a project that requires you to pastiche a hand-drawn product. And this is something that I've had happen in the past where a client wants a cartoon to look like it was drawn in the classical era, or it was drawn during the 1980s for TV. In that case, this is the timing you want. And were you to create a puppet system and create these perfect digital paths, it might catch the eye as not quite feeling like period detail. It's extremely subtle, but this spacing would have been seen in the 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, even the 90s. But this spacing, no, very unusual. Maybe someone like Richard Williams might have done something like this, but very, very few people would have. So please keep that in mind when you are tackling projects that might want to look like they're pre-digital, because this is the kind of thing that could trip the eye. Even a non-sophisticated audience might notice. They won't be able to tell you why, but they might know something doesn't feel right, and that might be it. In a previous movie, and this is going back a way, I created this very simple and graphic movie to show you how to do a secondary action on a cape. And these can be tricky because sometimes they can stick and not feel quite real. So this was a nice example timing, just to give you a feel for what you might do to break out of it. There's some nice stuff going on here where you can see here we have this S curve, and here it reverses and then overshoots a little and settles. So let's take a look at some of the other artwork from it. That was what the cape looked like when we overlaid everything. I know it looks like a spaghetti bowl, but you can get the idea for the general placement of the different keyframes. And here's what it looked like. Not too bad, but again, it does look synthetic because it was done in basically animate CC. So it has that kind of feel to it. The other thing to watch out for too, see, I plotted the arcs on the endpoints of the cape. Very important. That stops it from moving in straight lines, which is a real eye catcher. So again, here are the different overlays. So since I did this, I've really become very fond of animating in Photoshop and drawing by hand again. And the beauty of doing that is you're not limited to these simple cape shapes that are basically a glorified rectangle. So let me show you what I came up with. So this is the scene. I'm going to play it through. And remember, when Photoshop plays animation, it doesn't do a very good job of the real frame rate, but it gives you a feel for the general motion. It's not too bad. Let's have a look at this when it's rendered out. It's pretty nice. One thing it doesn't have, and actually turns out it doesn't really need it, is that reversal. The curvature of the cape is pretty much the same. It's like this little S curve. I think it might come back to more like a C curve here. If it's a reversing, it's a very gentle one. Now, a couple of things that I've kind of changed in my approach since the earlier cape. I've come to go back to timing traditionally by drawing by hand. We would draw generally on even numbered frames and on twos. So you draw on 1, 3, 5, 7, 9. Because when you're drawing by hand, you don't want to draw every frame if you can help it. Because if it takes you 20 minutes to do one drawing, then you don't want to double that unnecessarily. So in this case, we're seeing the cape basically animating just on every second frame. So it's, 12 frames a second rather than 24. And that still looks pretty smooth. So I do have a course in the library on how to animate in Photoshop. I'm pushing it pretty hard because my work has really just improved tremendously. I've recovered like a lot of my old hand drawing good habits that I think I had begun to lose by animating too much with puppet systems and vector graphics. And it's very liberating to be able to draw. It does take a bit longer. There's no arguing that, but it does allow you to do shapes here that you can't do easily or at all if you're working with like a shape tween form, because these kind of shapes here just aren't practical. They would require a phenomenal amount of engineering. So these kind of things here, which I think are very beautiful and are well beyond most puppet systems. And we're really getting back to like hand-drawn techniques here. So let me show you, if I strip this of all of the keys, or the in-betweens rather, so we're just looking at the keyframes. So again, I'm drawing on odd numbers. The timing is very similar to what I showed you in the original course. But again, from 21 to 29, we're easing out, and then an even timing here. And then we're easing into 45, and then the cape overshoots and settles. So it's a very simple system. What I'm going to do is show you how I would approach drawing the cape. So the first thing I would have drawn here, well, I have a general idea about where it's going to go, but if you're becoming a bit stuck with these very complex shapes, they're really not. I draw the spine of whatever curve I want. And then it's a question of, I'm going to draw through here, which you don't see in the original, but this is a three-dimensional form. And you simply draw through all of these. So whatever shape I want, if I want like a really complex curved form, I draw that spine of the base, that hem, and then you attach your lines accordingly. And you can rub out the stuff that you're not going to be seeing. That's crude. I would spend a lot more time, obviously, finessing this in the final version, but you get the general gist of it. So you have this invisible little hemline, this curve that you've built the entire form around. And you can come up with shapes there that you can animate that are far more interesting than this, which is essentially what you get when you're working with a simple vector primitive. So you might find this is completely unnecessary for what you do, in which case that's okay. But if you feel that your work is being limited, that you think, oh, I wish I could do that really flowing, exciting, dramatic cape business, then this is how I would go about it. You can even do this kind of work inside a lot of the Puppet software, like Harmony has beautiful drawing tools. And you can, with a bit of work, you can get this kind of stuff done also in Animate CC and then incorporate this into Puppet systems to add like a little bit of hand-drawn magic to them. So I would strongly recommend you consider this if you haven't done so already, because it'll just level up your scene. This is another movie that takes an old animation that I did and approach it with a more traditional animation style. So here's the original content. So we had the cape from my drawing course. So the figure on the left, like Superman's cape, is very thin, very silky, folds a lot. The one on the right's a thicker material. So you have to remember what material your secondary characteristics is made out of. In this case, I wanted to go with the left side, something that would be much more vulnerable to wind. So that was one thing to bear in mind about this. And then the question is, how do you draw this? And you can think of it as a very simple rectangular form. Then you add the spine around the bottom and you construct the different folds then based around that. So the cape has a structure to it. It's not just like an arbitrary collection of wiggles. Now, in that course, when I decided to animate it, of course, time is precious. And in that case, the quickest way to animate it was to use a tweening software like Adobe Animate CC. Toon Boom Harmony would produce very similar results. If you use shape tweening or morph tweening, then you get these kind of forms. And it's fine. It can look really nice. Very simple. It's totally respectable. Gets the job done. And here was the original timing as well. So what I wanted to do was to apply my newfound love of hand-drawn animation, or my original training, to see could I break out of these very simple geometrical forms and do things that are hard or impossible to do in shape tweening. So here is my hand-drawn version of the same scene. And it's much nicer, much more organic. I'm going to go through it frame by frame. And you can see we can break out of the basic simple structure. And now we have access to all these kind of lovely forms and shapes. Overshoot and settle. Let's render this and have a look. So we can imagine he's standing on top of a skyscraper or something. It's got a really nice fluidity to it. And notice again that there are some nice reversals going on. So we have this S curve here, and then it reverses into this. And that gives a nice fluidity to it. So these are the kind of transformations that with a shape tween, I think would be very, very difficult to achieve. Probably could be done, but with probably even more effort than just drawing it. Because these kind of folds here, when this thing is breaking around like this, and we're seeing the underside of the cape, I wouldn't want to have to do that with a tweening system like an Animate CC or Toon Boom Harmony. These kind of things are so free and so fluid that doing them by hand, by drawing them frame by frame, I think is the best approach. So I don't want to go too deeply into how I did this, other than to give you like a very brief overview. So here we have our start frame. And again, Photoshop does have a timeline feature, and you can find this under Windows Timeline. In older versions, CS5, it's under a window called Animation. So I have a course in the library that already covers how to do this. So if this is enticing to you, I can't recommend it enough. I haven't had as much fun since I began figuring out how to draw and animate in Photoshop. So what I do is I color code my keys in gray, my breakdown layers are in red, and then as we shuttle through the timeline, it's easier then to figure out where I am, because it's easy to get lost. It's not a very friendly timeline. It's just about usable. The beauty of this for me is that I have access to the brushes. That my favorite drawing brushes are all in Photoshop, so now I can animate with them as well. So again, we have our keys and timing charts are here, 1 through 9. So we're easing out. Let me scroll back down here. So here's number 1. That's the exposed here. We slow out. Now number 9, that's our next key drawing. There's a breakdown on 11, another key on 13, and then we're going to slow into 19. 1, 2, 3. Now we have another slow in up here. and then we're falling and overshooting and settling. So it's a very, I find, intuitive way to work once you become comfortable with navigating the way you can use groups and folders to nest the different layers of animation. The other thing too that I do with this, which is really tremendous, is I can create layers for my arcs. And that's what keeps it's not perfect, but it's close enough. Keeps the points of the cape from completely going off the rails. And by marking out where each corner point is, it enabled me to stop it from going too far, in the wrong arc path, or it's not quite perfect there. I think it's going a little too high there, but honestly, it doesn't matter. I think it's going pretty well. Switch that off. So that's it. That is a more intricate cape flutter based on the material and the timing in the original course that I did. So this is basically another glorified push to try to get people to consider hand drawing at least elements of your character that are not really well served by using a puppet or a shape tween system. In the previous movie, I animated a cape flutter using shape tweening. And this is a third movie that deals with my direct comparison with what it looks like when you do these kind of cape flutters using a puppet system or a shape tweening, as opposed to drawing it by hand, and which one is better. So this is the basic timing of a flutter cycle, and very quick. So it's 4 keys and they go back and forward very fast because you want to get that very quick up, down, up, down, up, down, like a feather being held before a fan. It's going to move very quickly. So this is what it looked like. So let's take a look at what this looks like when you do it by hand. So if it feels a bit slower, that's because Photoshop doesn't really play the animation timeline properly. So let's take a look at this when it's rendered out. That's more like it. So I think this already looks a lot better. And if we stop and pause this and just go through this, you can see lovely shapes like this kind of effect here. Very, very hard to see that happening very easily through a tweened rectangle, which is what the original course was. So, and you get these nice reversals here and a nice feeling of organic movement, this wave-like motion from this curve here down to there, and then it dissipates here. It's the same timing. There's very little difference in the timing between the two versions. The main difference is the freedom when you draw to be able to create shapes and forms that are very difficult to do with a shape tweened element. So in this case, I could easily puppet rig the character and then hand draw the cape. So again, I'm trying to really convince people to strongly consider, if you have drawing abilities, to try to look at the character and figure out, are there parts of the character that I could draw? And have the freedom then to be able to break out of puppets, if not draw the entire thing entirely, if you feel the urge to do so. But this is certainly one part where you could liberate yourself from, I think, a lot of the tedium of shape tweening or morph tweening if you're using Toon Boom Harmony.